ladies and gentlemen, to begin Postmodernism. I'm abstracting partly from a course by Robert Garmong, G-A-R-M-O-N-G, and if you're interested in the subject, you should get the course at the Ayn Rand Institute's website. Now, he starts off with asking the question, why should we study postmodernism at all? Why should we study the subject of postmodernism? And he says it's because to understand a culture, it's necessary to understand the highs and the lows of that culture, the best and the worst. We have to know, he says, the Bill Gates of the cultures and the Mother Teresa of the cultures to understand any given culture we're looking at. And if we're looking at our own culture, postmodernism is important. Just so you know, he would affirm Bill Gates to be the virtuous and Mother Teresa to be the blackness. But that's a side note. The term postmodernism, Mr. Garmong says, was first used in a context of literary theory in the 1960s. He's heard references of it going back as early as 1930s, but he's never seen those himself, he says. The earliest he's seen is the 1960s. Now, some spin-offs, just to get an idea in our head of what postmodernism is. Some spin-offs of postmodernism, starting as it did in the 1960s or so, are the ecology and environmental movement, feminism, the anti-globalization movement, anti-Westernism, multiculturalism. It is essentially a relativistic philosophy. Postmodernism is essentially relativistic. There's no way to judge, there's no objectivity, there's no, everything's relative. What's true for me may not be true for you. That's the epistemic essence of postmodernism. From that springs everything. So Mr. Garmong covers 4 topics in his course, which we're just going to touch on the first one, and some comments of mine, and that's it. What is postmodernism? 2. Postmodernism in literary theory. 3. Postmodernism in architecture and art. And 4. Postmodernism in politics. So he now makes a disclaimer, or a little note, Mr. Garmong does, that this lecture course he gives will not fully explain postmodernism because it cannot be fully explained. The postmodernism itself is intentionally vaguely defined term, even by the people who use it. They begin their whole game by dispensing with the law of identity and glorifying contradiction. So this intensifies the difficulty of studying and trying to get a hold of what postmodernism is, because the advocates of it and the adherents of it are all sometimes against each other, theoretically and so forth, and contradictory with other people in the postmodern school, and frequently self-contradictory, because they don't mind a contradiction. So how about some names now? Let's look at some examples of this type of person. Andy Warhol in art, Leslie Fiebler and Philip Roth in literature or novels. In architecture, Robert Venturi, Philip Johnson, Frank Gehry. If you've seen the Bilbao Museum in Bilbao, Spain, Frank Gehry, that's just a mess. In law, Stanley Fish. In philosophy, Jacques Derrida, Michael Foucault. These are postmodernists. So if you like their ideas, you're in danger of being a postmodernist. And someone said something to me was, is it like a disease? Is it that bad? You use postmodernism like an insult. A disease is one thing, because it's not really your fault if you get a disease, and even if it were your fault, you got it, there's not much you can do about it unless you have medicine. So it's not a personal fault. Postmodernism, or believing in postmodernism, is a personal fault and does have to be held against a person. So yes, it's kind of like a disease. It is an insult. What unites all of these people we've just named? Andy Warhol, Robert Venturi, Frank Gehry, Jacques Derrida, Michael Foucault. What brings them all together? What's their similarity? What's their common ground? And the answer is collectivism. But not good old Marxist collectivism. Not the good old collective of the world and workers unite. Not that stuff. They believe that's worn out. They believe in tribal collectivism. They believe in the identity of the group. So they believe that you have to trace your own roots. If you have any individual meaning for yourself, you have to trace your own roots down to the smallest subgroup possible. Your religion in your particular town, in your city. This is why every single individual human being's story, this is the idea of naturalism, every human individual story is precious, no matter who or what or where, and therefore we can just study any of them with meaning. It's not necessary to find Howard Rourke or John Galt to study. We can just study, you know, the guy on the street. That's naturalism. So it's tribal collectivism. And they all accept any basis, race, gender, culture, subculture, rebellion against culture, rebellion against everything, anything to get in their little group, have their little tribal group. And they're not rational, and they proclaim against rationality, as we shall see. So moving on, what is modernism? Because the postmodernists identify themselves as after-modernism. They identify themselves in terms of modernism. Now, it's interesting to note, first of all, we should note that they don't mean, when they say postmodern, they don't mean anti-modern. They don't mean completely unmodern. They don't mean they reversed and destroyed everything modern. That's not what they mean. They mean they've developed from what's modern. So there was the ancient world, the medieval world, the modern world, and now the postmodern world. It's not the anti-modern or the backward to medieval, in their view. It's just the postmodern, the development, the next stage or whichever. So, because postmodernists identify themselves in terms of rebellion against modernism, we need to know what modernism itself is. And in this case, modern does not refer to iPods and space flight and F-16s and stealth technology and nuclear power plants, but to a more broad meaning, like modern as opposed to medieval and ancient. That's the scale we're looking at, because we're talking about philosophical epochs. The modern era, therefore, starts around the year 1600 AD. And there's two individuals Mr. Garmong points out as being the essence of the modern period's beginning. Descartes, René Descartes, who was 1596 to 1656, and Bacon, who was 1561 to 1626. These were the first modernists, according to Mr. Garmong. And I think he makes a good case for it. They were both against religion. They rebelled against religion and medievalism and scholasticism even, which was Aristotelian, but still shackled by the church. And they rebelled against this in favor of reason. Now, Descartes did it wrong, and Bacon did it right, but still, they both saw themselves as, defending reason, finding a rational basis. Bacon brought out the rational basis for science. He said, collect large bodies of data and then analyze on similarities. While Descartes said we need a basis from which we can deduce everything. We need an axiom. We need something we know for sure. I think, therefore I am. Now, he's wrong about that. We know that we are. We don't know that by thinking. We just know we are. Here we are because we think. But it's not I think, therefore I am. It's I think because I am. And I am, therefore I will think, is what it should be. But anyways, Descartes and Bacon were the beginning of the modern period. And they rebelled against religion. The postmodernists are rebelling against the modern era. So, the principles of modernism. In other words, what is postmodernism rebelling against? And these are things taken from postmodern sources. These are not in their words, but essentially their ideas, what they say the modern era is, and what they say we should rebel against, we should fix or change or whichever. And they're ultimately Hegelian. They believe they're part of there's this part and that